That summer started with an unexpected twist. My dad, who worked as a manager for a logistics company, announced he had to fly to Asia for a 2-week business trip. He didn't want to leave me alone in our suburban house in Austin, so he decided I'd stay with his old friend named Jeffrey. Hello, my dear friends. In this story I'm going to tell you about how one summer turned my life upside down. Get yourself comfortable, grab a cup of tea or coffee, and let's go on this journey together. It's going to be warm and exciting, I promise. My name is Nolan, and I was 22 years old back then, just finishing my 3rd year at university in Austin, Texas. I was studying architecture, but honestly, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that for the rest of my life. I vaguely remembered Jeffrey from my childhood when he'd sometimes come over for barbecues or family dinners. He always seemed tall, reserved, with a voice that sounded like it could calm any storm. But I hadn't seen him in about 10 years, and all I knew was that he lived alone in a neat house in the suburbs of Charleston, South Carolina, and worked as a physiotherapist for professional athletes. My dad said Jeffrey would be happy to have me, and I, though not exactly thrilled about the idea, agreed because I didn't want to stay home by myself. I arrived in Charleston in the morning after a long 5-hour bus ride. Jeffrey met me at his house, and I immediately noticed he hadn't changed much, though there was now a bit of gray in his dark hair. He stood in the doorway, wearing a navy blue t-shirt and black sweatpants, his strong shoulders looking like he could lift anything. His skin was slightly tanned, and his smile was warm and confident. "Nolan, you've grown so much, I wouldn't have recognized you on the street," he said, extending his hand for a handshake. I shook his hand, feeling the warmth of his palm linger on my skin a little longer than I expected. Jeffrey's house was small but stylish, with wooden floors and large windows letting in the soft light of the morning sun. The air carried a faint smell of freshly brewed coffee and something herbal, maybe from a diffuser sitting on the windowsill. He showed me the room where I'd be staying and suggested we have coffee in the kitchen. We sat at the table, and he started asking me about my life, about how things were going at university. "How's school, Nolan? Still into architecture?" he asked, looking at me with genuine interest. I told him school was going fine, but I wasn't sure what I'd do after graduation. We talked for about an hour, and I noticed how Jeffrey listened carefully, never interrupting, his gaze so warm that I felt surprisingly at ease. When he got up to pour more coffee, his hand brushed my shoulder by accident, and I felt a slight jolt run through my skin. It was a fleeting touch, but it left a strange warmth I couldn't quite explain. Later, he suggested we take a walk in the backyard, where he had a small area with blooming magnolias and a wooden bench. We sat there, looking at the green fields in the distance, and I suddenly realized this summer might turn out to be nothing like I planned. The next morning after arriving in Charleston, I woke up to soft light filtering through the curtains in the guest room. I lay in bed, listening to Jeffrey already moving around in the kitchen somewhere in the house, and felt a strange calmness that wasn't typical for me. Usually, I'd wake up with a million thoughts about things I needed to do, but here, in this house, everything seemed slower, like time moved differently. I got up, pulled on a t-shirt and jeans, and headed to the kitchen, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. Jeffrey was standing at the stove, wearing a gray tank top and dark shorts, his movements confident, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. He turned around when he heard my footsteps and smiled in a way that made my chest feel warm. "Good morning, Nolan. I hope you slept well in the new room," he said, placing a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon in front of me. I nodded, thanked him, and sat at the table, noticing how his gaze lingered on me a little longer than necessary. We ate, talking about small things, and I realized Jeffrey always asked questions that made me talk about myself, like he was genuinely interested. After breakfast, Jeffrey suggested I help him with a small project in the garden that he wanted to finish before lunch. He mentioned he was planning to replant some rose bushes, and I agreed because I didn't want to sit around doing nothing. We went out to the yard and I watched him work, his hands moving with such precision that it was almost mesmerizing. At one point, he asked me to hold a bush while he dug a hole, and our hands brushed when he handed me the plant. I felt his fingers linger on mine, and it was so natural that I didn't know how to react. We worked for about an hour, and I noticed Jeffrey often glanced at me, but he didn't say anything extra, just smiled whenever I caught his eye. Then he suggested we take a break and brought us some cold lemonade, which we drank while sitting on the bench in the shade of the magnolias. Have you ever thought about getting into something like gardening, Nolan? He asked, looking at me with curiosity. I told him I'd never tried it, but I liked how calming it felt, especially here in his garden. He nodded, and his hand, resting on the back of the bench, was so close to my shoulder that I could feel the warmth of his skin. That evening, Jeffrey suggested watching a movie, and I agreed because it sounded like a nice way to unwind after the day. We settled on the couch in the living room, and he put on an old film about traveling that he said always inspired him. I tried to sit at a distance, but the couch wasn't that big, and at one point, our knees touched when I reached for the remote. Jeffrey didn't move away, and I decided not to either, feeling how that slight contact made my heart beat faster. The movie played, but I barely followed the plot because all my attention was on how close we were sitting. Jeffrey turned to me and asked if I was cold because he noticed I shivered a little. I said I was fine, but he still got up, grabbed a soft blanket, and draped it over both of us, sitting a bit closer than before. His shoulder was now touching mine, and I could feel the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of his t-shirt. We sat like that until the movie ended, and I realized it was the first time I felt so comfortable around someone I barely knew. On the third day of my stay in Charleston, I woke up with a feeling that something inside me was starting to change, though I couldn't quite put it into words. The morning was warm, and I could hear Jeffrey working in the yard, probably finishing up with the flowers we started on yesterday. I got up, washed my face, and walked to the kitchen, where a fresh pot of coffee was waiting, along with a note from Jeffrey saying he'd be in the yard if I wanted to join him. I poured myself a cup, took a sip, and felt the bitter taste wake me up, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Jeffrey. I stepped outside and saw him kneeling by the flower bed, his navy blue t-shirt slightly sticking to his back from sweat, his hands covered in dirt. He turned around when he noticed me, and his smile was so warm that I felt my heart beat faster. "Nolan, you're just in time, I'm finishing up with these roses," he said, wiping his hands on his pants and standing up. I walked closer, and he asked me to help water the flowers, handing me a watering can, our fingers brushing, and I felt his warmth transfer to me like a small electric shock. We worked together, and I noticed Jeffrey was standing closer to me than usual, his elbow occasionally touching mine when he leaned down to adjust a bush. At one point, he looked at me, his eyes so deep that I felt my breathing become uneven. "You look thoughtful, Nolan. Is everything okay with you?" he asked, his voice soft but with a hint of concern. I told him everything was fine, I was just enjoying the moment, and he smiled, placing his hand on my shoulder, his fingers lingering there, the warmth of his palm spreading across my skin. After working in the garden, Jeffrey suggested we cool off inside, and we went back to the house, where he grabbed some cold lemon water from the fridge. We sat on the couch in the living room, and he moved closer, our knees almost touching, his hand resting on the back of the couch, right near my neck. "You know, Nolan, I really enjoy spending time with you. You make this house feel alive," he said, looking straight into my eyes. I felt my face heat up and told him I liked being here too, especially with him. That evening, Jeffrey suggested we cook dinner together, and I agreed because it sounded like a nice way to spend the evening. We made pasta with vegetables, and he stood next to me at the stove, showing me how to chop the peppers properly. His hand guided mine, and I felt the warmth of his fingers gently pressing against mine as he explained. "Like this, Nolan, take your time, let it be neat," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, and I felt his breath on my neck, sending shivers down my spine. We ate dinner at the table, and Jeffrey played some soft music that created a cozy atmosphere, the light from the lamp above making everything feel warm and gentle. After dinner, he suggested we sit on the back porch, and we brought a blanket because the evening had turned cool. We sat close, looking at the stars, and Jeffrey placed his hand on my knee, his touch light but warm, and I felt my heart race. "Nolan, I'm so glad you're here. This summer has become special because of you," he said, his voice full of sincerity, and I turned to him, noticing how his gaze lingered on my lips. I told him I was glad to be here too, and in that moment, he leaned a little closer, his face so near that I could feel the warmth of his breath. We didn't move, just looked at each other, and I felt something intangible but powerful hanging between us. Then he slowly moved his hand from my knee, but his fingers brushed across my palm, leaving a feeling I couldn't forget for the rest of the night. On the fourth day in Charleston, I woke up with a feeling that I could no longer ignore what was happening between me and Jeffrey. The morning was quiet, and I lay in bed, listening to him moving around the house, his steps soft but confident, like he always knew what he was doing. I got up, washed my face, and headed to the kitchen, where Jeffrey was already making breakfast, his dark t-shirt hugging his shoulders, the smell of fresh toast filling the air. He turned around when I walked in, and his smile was so warm that I felt my heart tighten with something I couldn't name. "Good morning, Nolan. I thought we could have breakfast on the porch today," he said, placing a plate of toast and eggs in front of me. I agreed, and we went out to the back porch, where the morning sun softly lit the wooden table. We ate, talking about plans for the day, and I noticed Jeffrey looking at me with a new kind of gentleness, like he felt something had shifted between us two. When I reached for my glass of juice, my hand brushed against his, and he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers lightly squeezed mine, and I felt a warmth that spread through my whole body. After breakfast, Jeffrey suggested we take a walk in a nearby park, and I agreed because I wanted to spend more time with him. We walked along a path surrounded by tall trees, and at one point, he stopped to show me an old oak tree that he said was his favorite spot. We stood close, and I felt his hand touch my back, guiding me closer to the tree, his touch warm and steady. "Nolan, have you ever felt like something was just meant to happen?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, and I turned to him, feeling my breathing become uneven. I told him I had, especially in the last few days, and his eyes met mine, filled with so much warmth that I couldn't look away. He stepped closer, and I felt his hand slide to my waist, his fingers gently pressing against me, and I didn't resist because it all felt so right. We stood like that for a few seconds, just looking at each other, and I could feel his breath getting closer, his face so near that I could see every detail in his eyes. Then he leaned in, and I felt his forehead touch mine, a gentle movement that made my heart beat so hard I thought he might hear it. That evening, after dinner, we were sitting on the couch again, and Jeffrey played some soft music that created a cozy atmosphere in the room. I could feel the tension between us reaching its peak, and when he turned to me, his hand resting on my knee, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Jeffrey, I don't know how to say this, but I feel something for you that I can't explain," I said, my voice shaky, but I knew I had to be honest. He looked at me, his eyes full of understanding, and he said he felt the same, that he'd felt it since the moment I arrived. He moved closer, and I felt his hand lift to my face, his fingers softly brushing my cheek, and I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into that feeling. We sat there, his hand still touching my face, and I placed my palm on his chest, feeling his heart beating as fast as mine. Then he leaned in, and I felt the warmth of his breath. We were so close that I knew this was the moment we'd both been waiting for. We didn't rush, just savoring the feeling of being so near, and I realized this was the start of something I could no longer deny. On the fifth day in Charleston, I woke up with a feeling that everything that happened the previous evening wasn't just a moment, but something much bigger. I lay in bed, remembering how Jeffrey touched my face, how his breath mixed with mine, and how we sat so close that I could feel the warmth of his body even through our clothes. But that morning brought not only memories but also anxiety, because I knew I had to talk to my dad, who was supposed to call today to check on me. I got up, washed my face, and went to the kitchen, where Jeffrey was already making breakfast, his movements as confident as ever, but I noticed a slight thoughtfulness in his eyes. "Good morning, Nolan. I made us an omelet with vegetables. Are you hungry?" he asked, placing a plate in front of me. I thanked him and sat at the table, but I couldn't focus on the food because thoughts about talking to my dad wouldn't leave me alone. Jeffrey, noticing my unease, put his hand on my shoulder and asked if everything was okay, his voice soft but with a hint of worry. I decided to be honest and told him I needed to talk to my dad, and I wasn't sure how he'd react if he found out about what was happening between us. Jeffrey nodded, his hand still resting on my shoulder, and he said he understood my concerns, but I should do what I thought was right. "Nolan, I'm here to support you, no matter what you decide," he added, and his words made me feel warm, but the anxiety still didn't go away. After breakfast, I went to my room to call my dad, and when he answered, his voice sounded cheerful, like he was happy to hear from me. "Nolan, how are you doing? Everything okay in Charleston with Jeffrey?" he asked, and I felt my stomach tighten with nerves. I told him everything was great, but then I added that I needed to tell him something important, and I wasn't sure how he'd take it. My dad went quiet for a few seconds, and I heard his tone get more serious as he asked me to go on. I took a deep breath and said that over these past few days, I'd grown close to Jeffrey, and it wasn't just friendship, but something more that I felt for him. My dad went silent again, and I felt my heart beat faster, waiting for his reaction. "Nolan, do you realize what you're saying? This is serious. Jeffrey is my friend, and he's much older than you," he said, his voice tense, and I could tell he wasn't thrilled about the news. I told him I understood, but it wasn't just a fleeting crush, and I wanted to be honest with him because he was my dad. The conversation ended awkwardly. My dad said he needed time to think about it, and I felt a heaviness settle on my shoulders because I didn't want to disappoint him. I went back to the living room, where Jeffrey was waiting for me, his eyes full of concern when he saw my face. "Nolan, what did he say? Are you okay?" he asked, standing up and walking over to me. I told him about the conversation, and he hugged me, his arms warm and strong, and I felt the tension start to melt away as he held me. We stood like that for a few minutes, his arms wrapped around me, and I pressed myself against his chest, feeling his heart beating steadily, calming me down. "Nolan, I know this is hard, but we'll figure it out together, I promise," he said, his voice low, and I felt his fingers gently stroke the back of my neck. I nodded, not pulling away from him, and in that moment, I realized that despite the conflict with my dad, I didn't want to lose what Jeffrey and I had. On the 6th day in Charleston, I woke up with a feeling that I needed to find a way to make peace with my dad's reaction without losing what Jeffrey and I had. The morning was cool, and I lay in bed, listening to Jeffrey moving around in the kitchen, his steps so familiar that I felt warmth just thinking about him. I got up, washed my face, and went to him, knowing we needed to talk about what happened yesterday and how to move forward. Jeffrey was standing at the stove, making pancakes, his dark t-shirt slightly hugging his shoulders, the smell of vanilla and butter filling the kitchen. He turned around when I walked in, and his smile was soft, but I noticed a hint of worry in his eyes, like he'd been thinking about our conversation too. "Good morning, Nolan. I thought some pancakes with berries might lift your spirits," he said, placing a plate in front of me. I thanked him and sat at the table, feeling his gaze linger on me, and I knew he was waiting for me to start talking. I told him I needed to talk to my dad again because I didn't want any tension between us, and I wanted him to understand how much this meant to me. Jeffrey nodded, his hand touching mine, and he said he supported me, and if I wanted, he could talk to my dad himself to explain his intentions. "Nolan, I want you to know I'm serious about what we have," he added, his voice low, and I felt his fingers squeeze mine, the warmth calming me down. I called my dad later that morning, and this time his voice sounded calmer, like he'd had time to think about our last conversation. "Nolan, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I'm still worried, but I want you to be happy," he said, and I felt relief because it was a step forward. I explained that Jeffrey made me happy, and we both understood the challenges that might come with it, but we were willing to work through them. My dad said he needed time to get used to it, but he didn't want to lose our connection, and that was all I needed to hear. I went back to the living room, where Jeffrey was waiting, and when I told him about the conversation, his face lit up with a smile, and he hugged me, his arms so warm that I felt all my worries melt away. We stood there, his arms wrapped around me, and I pressed myself against his chest, feeling his breath on the back of my neck, so natural that I didn't want to let go. "Nolan, I'm so glad your dad gave us a chance. It means we can move forward," he said, his voice soft, and I felt his fingers glide down my back, leaving warmth behind. That evening, we decided to celebrate this small reconciliation, and Jeffrey suggested having dinner on the back porch, where we could watch the sunset. We cooked together, and I felt his hand brush mine as he handed me a bowl of salad, his touches so gentle that I couldn't help but smile. After dinner, we sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, and Jeffrey moved closer, his hand resting on my shoulder while I laid my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. We sat there, watching the sunset, and I felt his fingers gently run through my hair, his touches so light but so meaningful that I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the moment. "Nolan, I want you to know you're important to me, and I'll do everything to make this work," he said, his voice almost a whisper, and I turned to him, feeling his breath come closer. I told him I felt the same, and in that moment, we just sat there, holding each other, feeling the warmth and closeness that bound us together. On the 7th day in Charleston, I woke up with a feeling that everything had finally fallen into place, and I was ready to accept what Jeffrey and I had as something real and lasting. The morning was clear, and I lay in bed, listening to Jeffrey moving around the house, his steps so familiar that I felt warmth just knowing he was nearby. I got up, washed my face, and went to the kitchen, where he was already making breakfast, his dark t-shirt hugging his shoulders, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. "Good morning, Nolan. I thought we could do something special today," Jeffrey said, placing a plate of toast with avocado in front of me. I smiled, feeling his gaze linger on me, and asked what he meant, because his voice had a hint of excitement. He said he wanted to take me to a little spot not far from Charleston, where we could spend the day together, and I agreed, because I knew I'd go anywhere with him. We drove to a small lake surrounded by trees, and Jeffrey brought a picnic basket he'd prepared with sandwiches, fruit, and cold lemonade. We spread a blanket on the grass, and I watched him set out the food, his movements so confident that I couldn't take my eyes off him. We ate, talking about what would happen next, and I told him I wanted to stay here with him even after my dad came back from his trip. Jeffrey looked at me, his eyes full of warmth, and said he wanted the same, and we'd find a way to make it work. After eating, we lay on the blanket, looking at the sky, and I felt his hands slide to mine, his fingers intertwining with mine, and I felt a warmth that spread through my whole body. We lay there, his body so close that I could feel his breath, and I turned to him, noticing how his gaze lingered on my lips. "Nolan, I never thought I'd find someone who makes me feel the way you do," he said, his voice low, and I felt his hand lift to my face, his fingers softly brushing my cheek. I moved closer, and he wrapped his arms around me, his hands warm and strong, and I pressed myself against his chest, feeling his heart beating steadily, calming me down. We lay there, his fingers running through my hair, and I placed my hand on his chest, feeling the warmth of his body through his t-shirt. "Jeffrey, I want this to be the start of something bigger. I don't want it to end," I said, my voice quiet but full of certainty. He said this was the start, and he'd do everything to make sure we stayed together, his voice so sincere that I felt my eyes fill with tears. We spent the whole day by the lake, and as the sun began to set, we sat there, holding each other, watching the sunset, and I felt it was the perfect end to a week that changed my life. I realized I hadn't just found a summer fling, but something real, something that would stay with me for a long time. And I was ready for it because with Jeffrey, I felt like I was home. Now I want to turn to you, my dear viewers, and ask a few questions I'd love for you to answer in the comments. What do you think lies ahead for me and Jeffrey, and how would you have handled my dad's reaction if you were in my shoes? Also, have you ever had a moment where you knew you'd found someone special, and how did you know? Please share, I'd really love to hear your thoughts.